When I take a look at all the clients that I've worked with as a psychotherapist, I can say that without question, anxiety has come up with every client. Sometimes it's immediately, it's the first thing we're talking about. Other times it emerges after many sessions or even a year of work, that theme appears. And it's essentially endemic to the human condition, from what I can see, that all of us, to some extent, experience anxiety at different times within our lives. And I think this really makes sense. I think it's a very rational response because anxiety is highly related to our freedom, to our agency, our ability to choose one thing over another. And it's sort of a part of what we would call suffering. That to suffer, to some extent, is to feel the weight and pull of anxiety. And I'd like us to notice this dynamic that there's this sort of problem where we're always in the present moment concerned about what is going to happen in the future. Because we have to survive into the day, into the week, into the year. And to survive is to walk forward into time. And yet there's always an unknown, that we're always not completely in control of what could happen. That there's always our internal response towards what could happen in the future that's important to recognize. But there, at the same time, there is the reality that we can't control what we don't have direct control over. We don't know what the system that we're embedded in is going to do. And so there's always this pushing and pulling about what the present is and what the future might become, and the unknown in between those two. And as we unpack that unknown, I want us to first notice that fundamentally, we are a being that has a body and a mind. We're not just disembodied selves with a consciousness that floats above, but is embedded within our physical reality. And because of that, this body is going to have all sorts of sensations and feelings, and this mind's going to have all these thoughts about what could happen or might happen. I think it's very easy to see here. This is why drugs, alcohol are so powerful, because they get into that part of us, that the networks of our mind or the biology of our being, and they can ameliorate or take away temporarily these sensations of choice, of anxiety, of worry. They can numb us out. They can make things feel more okay right in the moment. And it's not that anything external out of us is shifted. You know, by drinking a half a fifth of vodka, you're not going to solve the world's problems, but you are going to numb out reality. And you're going to make it somehow feel okay, at least temporarily, you know, for 15 minutes, for an hour, for, you know, some small period of time, okay. Now, of course, there's big consequences that follow that. But I just want us to notice here that the biology that we run on, you know, the hardware of our existence, so to speak, it's at the foundation of our responses to our survival and to that unknown of walking into the future, that we have to account for that biology. Now, one layer up from that biology, we can think of anxiety, I believe, in three core ways. The first is around our choices and how our relationship to choice emerges. The second is what I would call our relationship to conflict, and I'll unpack that a bit more in a minute. And the third one is how we respond to fear. Now, I'm going to actually do these in reverse order, not because I believe that this is the correct sort of hierarchy, but because I don't think if we tackle the first two, fear and conflict, that we can understand choice correctly. So let's first look at fear. What do I mean by fear and its relationship to anxiety and our freedom? Think about this for a minute with me. Imagine that you're, say, in a house and it's very quiet in this house. Maybe the house is out in the country somewhere where there's not really a lot around you. Maybe you're in a rocking chair and you're sitting there listening to this podcast, right? And all of a sudden you hear a scream, a loud noise. It sounds like a human voice, but it's kind of muffled and you're not sure what you just heard. Was that an animal? Was that a person? There's no one else around here. What was that? What should I do? Should I get up and look around? Should I call the police? What's next? Am I in danger? Now, for some of us, we might immediately regulate ourselves and become okay with that unknown. And it is an unknown. What could happen in the future? Are we under threat? Are we not? Is someone being hurt? Are they not? And we can work through that. Or maybe we take some action to figure out what's going on. Like we walk down the road to our farmhouse and we go see if our neighbor's okay. Or we go outside and just see if I'm safe. Or, I don't know what it is. Or we call a friend. But others of us, maybe we've had traumatic experiences within our lives. And hearing something like that is deeply unsettling. And it threatens us to the core of our being. We start shaking. We start being very afraid. And the best we can do is like call 911 and like hide. My point here is just that dependent upon your constitution and the causes and conditions of your life, your response to events like this could be wildly different. And this component of being afraid, it really has a lot to do with how we take up and understand this other word, trauma. And for some of us that have a lot of trauma within our history, this component of anxiety can be really, really important to understand. And that no amount of kind of cognitive work or work about understanding our relationship to anxiety in terms of our body is going to help shift anything in a therapeutic sense until we feel safe, until we feel like everything's settled and okay, and that we attend to what we need to feel like that core safety rooted within trauma is going to make things feel like you can do the next step of the work. And trauma work is really its own thing. And I don't want to get into all of that within this talk, but I just want us to notice that some of us are going to have fears about our survival, where other of us are going to have fears about a kind of core anxiety of our being that's rooted in trauma. And yet others of us might even have fears about, say, our own mortality, of dying. And death anxiety, this lives in that place of fear. And if we think about the biggest unknown we can possibly fathom, it's about our own existence. What's going to happen when it no longer exists? And death anxiety is sort of another kind of fear, really fundamentally a kind of fear. Now, there's more I could say about fear, but for the purposes of this talk, I'd like to move on to the next kind of bucket that I've placed anxiety inside of. And this one I'd like to talk about is conflict-based anxiety. Now, what do I mean here? Let me give you an example so you can see the dynamic, and one that I think many of you are going to resonate with. Imagine that you go to a workplace, and at this workplace, there's something really broken about it. Your boss or your coworkers, or there's like communication norms that are screwed up, or I don't know what the situation is, and it doesn't actually matter so much. But there's a sensation it creates within you where you don't feel okay, you don't feel like this is right. And so you go home at night and you find yourself ruminating at night, falling asleep thinking about all these problems, about what you need to do about it. And it's just awful. You're getting worse sleep and you can't stop. And you just feel this core tension within your gut, that anxiety of, it just feels really hard to be with. It's affecting you all in your life everywhere. And you're afraid to speak out about it. You don't want others to see you negatively. You don't want to upset your boss. So you just sort of bottle it in. So then you go to work each day and you just don't say anything. You don't speak, and yet you go home and you have all these ruminating thoughts, and the cycle just repeats endlessly. This is what I call conflict-based anxiety. It's an internal response to an external conflict, or an externally based conflict. And we can take up just a few things within us to kind of fix it. We can either like obsess about it, or we can shut down completely. We could go and use drugs to try to stop the sensations that are problematic. Back to that biology piece. But fundamentally, this sort of anxiety is worked with in a really different way than you would work with fear-based anxiety or trauma-based anxiety. You're going to need to work with this by paying attention to those sort of signaling that's happening from your external environment, and then find ways you can actually take productive action to kind of close that loop and to take that rumination and turn it into activity and turn that inaction into action. And I've given you one example how this shows up for many people, but there are so many others. And often I find this sort of anxiety is really relational in its origin. Not always, but often as a very relational dynamic that has to do with others. And there's a whole universe to unpack within this about relational dynamics. And this kind of anxiety often is deeply connected to boundaries and boundary violations, codependency, things like narcissism are in there, things like our relationship to desires and how we manipulate others. And it can get very complicated. But I just want to suggest that this is another flavor of anxiety, another kind. Now, there is a third sort of anxiety, and I do see this as the primary one, in fact, but I think we can't understand it until we look at the other two. And this kind of anxiety is what I would just generally call as choice-based anxiety. That you have some choice in front of you, and you have to make a decision. That your own self, from your perspective, your subjective experience, that there is a choice to be made, and it could be very small, it could be very big. An example that I'll use to give you a sense of a small choice versus a big choice and how this plays out differently is, think about in front of you, you have a donut and a cookie to choose from. Which one would you like to eat? Pretty simple, right? For most of us anyways. But then think about the choice of, do you stay in the town you live in right now, or do you leave? And for most of us, I think that choice of moving or staying is going to have far more weight and more consequence to our life than the donut versus the cookie. Although there probably are a few of us out there that are paralyzed by the choice between a donut and a cookie. And I know that may sound ridiculous to some of you, but it's not about the external sort of weight of the choice. It's about the internal response. And if you're someone who lives in a world of complete sort of entanglement with anxiety, you might actually see these two choices as comparable, in fact. But if you're someone who's more lives in external reality and kind of follows a typical narrative of how we weight choices, you see these things as very differently. My point here is that we can't evaluate what a choice is worth from an external observer's perspective. We always have to conclude that the subjective experience of choice really profoundly matters. Now, there's another piece to choice that I want to highlight here in its relationship to agency and freedom, and it's about change. And this piece is particularly important for therapy, because therapy in the aggregate is often about change. It's about moving from who you are in the present to who do you want to become in the future. And as we widen who we're becoming, as we expand that space of possibilities, we are inevitably going to encounter the unknown. Because what is change but moving towards something that you don't know, right? Or that you don't know as fully. Think about somebody who wants to change jobs or careers, and that the task of part of the therapy is about empowering them and helping them make that shift. Well, to do that, you're going to have to take your current life and be willing to possibly get retrained, possibly take the risk of a new job, a new employer, all those things. And those are all unknowns. And you're expanding the possibility space of your life. And the thing is that as you do that and you encounter that unknown, almost inevitably, it's going to invoke anxiety because you don't know if it's going to work out. Will it be okay? Will you be safe? Will it create a bunch of conflict or not? And this is the thing I see people often struggle with deeply in therapy, is that as they begin to change, they're going to experience often, not always, but often more anxiety within their life. And what you have to understand is that this is an important signal of expanding awareness and possibilities. It's not a sign of failure necessarily. We have to be very, very careful about mistaking the anxiety we feel around choice as pathology. We often think of it as a problem to get rid of, but actually, when understood correctly and guided with someone who understands how to work with this and within a therapeutic context, what we can begin to see is that anxiety is sort of a signal or a part of us that taps into the core energetic qualities of our being. It's a kind of guide, a kind of place we can find vigor and energy to move forward into the project of living. That we can find it as a place of actually support rather than a place of pain or suffering. And that discernment between it being suffering versus being supportive is very, very hard to discern sometimes. And often this is a space around choice and our agency that requires a tremendous amount of care. And often within a therapeutic context, it can be quite a task to unpack how that looks like for each person. Okay, so let's just zoom out for a moment. Think about anxiety, kind of recap what I've talked about so far. So I see anxiety fundamentally about this dynamic as being the difference between the present and the future. And within that difference between now and what might happen, there is the unknown. And that unknownness is the root of where anxiety lives. It's first experienced within the body and within the networks of our mind, the hardware of our existence. And on top of that layer of our hardware of who we are, that biological construct we live in, there's kind of three broad buckets that I see. The first is this choice-based anxiety. How do we choose one thing versus another? What does that mean? How do we work with that? What freedom do we have? What freedoms do we not have? There's a second kind of a bucket that appears amongst these layers that is about how we take up conflicts and how do we internalize or externalize conflict. And then finally, there's a fear-based one about, are we under threat? Are we not under threat? Is this about our survival? Is it not? And how that becomes an overriding signal in some cases that becomes the most important thing to attend to, and how we work with that. Now, I want to add on another layer here at the risk of complicating an already very complicated picture. But I think this is an important piece to notice because it often gets left out. It gets left out of conversations. It gets left out of people when they talk about anxiety. It gets left out in our culture. And this is this difference between the external and the internal. And I've already been talking in this way, but I want to name it explicitly. And what I mean by that is whenever we look at, say, the choices we're going to make and the agency we have, we're always evaluating how the external environment, meaning like literally the objects around us, to the society we're in, to our friends, to our family, et cetera, how those influence and shape how we feel anxious and how we have to make choices around those anxieties. But then at the same time, we always have an internal response to that, a place where we can choose how we respond in an active sense. I'm going to give you two examples now that I think highlight this tension really profoundly. And they give us some clues and insights into how we might work with anxiety within us in a more deep and fundamental way. So I'd like to now look at these two examples, and we're going to use some names for these examples so we can help understand them. The first we're going to see is a person named Violet, and Violet is a monk, a monastic practitioner. She's a Buddhist monk. And the second example we're going to look at is a person named Jonathan. And Jonathan owns a day spa, a place where people go to get massages, a sauna, a hot tub, a cold plunge, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm using these two examples because they highlight a tension, a kind of philosophical tension around our freedom and agency and our relationship to anxiety. But this is not about moralization or about higher or lower or better than or worse. I'm just using these as two sort of extremes to highlight the tension within. So let's first look at Jonathan's life. So Jonathan is a successful business owner and owns this day spa. Maybe he has 20 employees. It's a very busy business. There's all sorts of pressures. He has to make a million small decisions every day. There's hiring to firing to training to keeping the customers happy to marketing to the business management side, all this stuff. There's really no rest to his work. He works an incredible amount. And the whole thing is really in service to keep his business going, to make it to the next month. And it's really difficult. It's a tremendous burden. And he feels this overwhelming sensation in him of anxiety because he feels so sort of like energetically charged and run by this whole thing. And notice within Jonathan's life how there's the externals, there's the whole system he's within. The business kind of has a mind and life of its own in a way. And yet there's that internal response that he has to it at the same time, about how he takes up all of that responsibility and takes it on as burden, how he perceives that. And he perceives it as deeply threatening, survival, and he can't let go of control, and it's very, very difficult for him. He's managing a million small unknowns all the time in service to keep this thing going in his life to feel safe. Now let's contrast that with Violet, the monk, the monastic. Now, Violet's life is very different. She lives an incredibly prescribed life. The temple she lives in, the monastic community, it has, a very defined schedule every day. She wakes up at the same time, very early, and there's sutra recitation and meditation and temple cleaning, and then, yard work, and it goes on and on and on. And her whole life is basically very prescribed. She doesn't really make any choices, or very few anyways. She doesn't even choose really what she eats. She just accepts what is. And you see this theme over and over in her life where she's just accepting what is there over and over again. She's just following the rhythms of what is present and what's available and not pushing or pulling on them. And we might see, if we juxtapose that with Jonathan, Jonathan has a lot of freedom to run his business and live his life, whereas Violet has almost none. She has very, very little freedom. And yet this is the interesting thing, is that Violet has almost no anxiety. And I don't say this from a theoretical standpoint. I'm telling you this from a lived experiential standpoint, that I've run across in my life many people that are long-term religious practitioners that live in monasteries. And they are some of the most anxiety-free people I have ever encountered in my life. I wouldn't even say many of them have what I would call anxiety. I would say they just live with ease and joy. You know, they don't really embody that space of anxiety at all. And it's fascinating for me to notice how they've given up on all the small choices. They don't make them. And yet, somehow through this relinquishment, they don't have to confront as deeply this kind of tension and this gut-wrenching sense, this burden that someone like Jonathan does. And I highlight this dichotomy not because one is better or worse, but it's because it points at something really interesting about the nature of anxiety and how it's related fundamentally to choice. I think there's this mistake we make, especially in American culture, where we think that our freedom, we have to hold on to it tightly and that we should maximize for it. You know, we should make sure that we have the most freedom possibly available, the most money, the most possibilities, the most choice. And we can just do anything we want completely without abandon and without even responsibility to others in some cases. Just keep going. And like somehow that's like part of the American project. And I would say it's even extends from America. I think this is just a human condition. I mean, America takes it up in a certain way, but I think this is probably endemic to the human condition just in general, that we just want maximum possibilities. But I think that's a huge mistake. We're not seeing the picture clearly. We're not understanding that all those small choices are a kind of burden, and that if not taken up very carefully and skillfully, they create a tremendous amount of weight within us and a tremendous burden to be responsible to them. And this is the thing you have to see, is that choice fundamentally creates responsibility. That to make one decision is to not make another. And we're always having to choose what we're going to be responsible to versus not. And avoidance is another kind of choice. And if you choose avoidance over and over again, that's going to create a different kind of life that's ignored something else. I'm reminded right now of the existential philosopher Soren Kierkegaard. He has this quote where he says that anxiety is the dizziness of freedom. And I think we actually experientially experience choice like this, that presented with different options, often we feel dizzy. Now, if we go back to the monk versus the business owner, we think about those different things as relationships to anxiety. What I would like to propose to you ultimately is that our freedom, our agency to choose, it's not about maximizing, but instead it's about accepting the unknowns that we want to live with. With the business owner, with Jonathan, he's managing 1 million small unknowns to keep his business surviving forever, or as long as he needs it to. And he's chosen a life in which he's deeply responsible to all these things. Whereas Violet, on the other hand, has given up choice. She's saying, I'm just not going to choose. I'm going to let others decide for me. The monastery is going to dictate my schedule. Whatever food shows up, I will eat. And she's sort of relinquished choice fundamentally in an effort to consider the biggest choices, our stance towards the great unknowns, our mortality itself. And again, this isn't about better or worse, but just notice how those two different orientations are an orientation fundamentally about the unknowns, how we're going to orient our life towards the unknowns. And in small ways, I think we are always choosing these two different paths. We're always, like the business owner, invested back in the world and really trying to keep our lives and things and relationships, our fears, whatever, going and going strongly to survive into the next day. And then at other times, we're kind of more like Violet, where we give up on these things. We say, well, it's okay how it is. We just live with what's there. And we're pushing and pulling always on this dynamic. And as I see it, that therapy itself, the work that I do with people, is fundamentally about trying to discern and figure out what unknowns I'm okay with versus what unknowns I'm not, and how I'm going to orient my life to become who I want to be. And we may not use that exact language, but fundamentally all choice, no matter how big or small, it all is rooted in this dynamic. What existentialists would call self-authorship, a kind of creative response to becoming in the world, to being responsible back to who we want to be. That's deeply enmeshed with both the externals of our life and the internals of our experience. That as a kind of stance, being as a sort of stance about how we might relate to the world as a whole. Now, as we near the end of this talk, you might be saying to yourself something like, wow, this was interesting and very philosophical or very cognitive, everything I've covered. But what do I do? Where does the rubber hit the road? How do I make action in my life? How do I change and move forward? What do I do actually practically? Well, the first thing I would say is to work with someone in a therapeutic context like myself. This isn't a kind of selfless plug here. It's just to point out that relationships are really important, and that having someone as a guide that can help you guide through the work of anxiety can be incredibly powerful. But barring that, the thing I would point you back towards is your body and your mind. That simply in the places where we feel stuck around anxiety, no matter what kind we're experiencing, that just orienting ourselves back towards the breath, feeling the rise and fall of the chest and of the stomach, breathing deeply, and then noticing the posture of our mind, noticing the echoes that are reverberating within it, and being deeply, deeply present with ourselves, even if it's hard to do that, is the first step often in encountering what is really there. A kind of inward-focused attention. And as you pay more attention to yourself, you can start to see and feel whatever your experience is. And that might feel very crazy within your mind or within your body, or very confusing. It might be very overwhelming. But often the more we engage with those processes, they can be kind of doorways to open up to a kind of unfolding of what truth is showing up for you in the moment about how you relate to the unknown.